This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I am Gaius. Germanicus is here. It's a spring evening in Londinium. It's a spring evening in the 21st century as well. All is well for philosophers. The situation in Rome is no change. Domitian remains the unpopular emperor. The situation in Washington, D.C. is unchanged. Mr. Trump remains the unpopular emperor. How many times have we had unpopular emperors? How many presidents have we had? It's the nature of the United States of America and inheriting the Roman talent for putting a man, always a man, in place so that we can dislike him and say, oh, we're so disappointed. I welcome Germanicus because we're going to attend immediately to what appears to be breaking news, although it will not surprise any of you. There is some explication necessary as to why this is ironic. Trump left in dark over airbase attacks on Russia, reads the London Telegraph. This has to do with a drone attack launched by Kyiv against Russian airfields where bombers capable of carrying nuclear weapons were parked out on the tarmac. And the Ukrainians wanted us to know that they struck them in daylight, one by one, so that you have a looped video of bomber after bomber being hit by a suicide drone. And significantly, in the middle of the shot are these two words, fail safe. What does that mean, fail safe? I welcome Germanicus because he can help me tell the story. This is from our youth. Germanicus, a very good day to you. Fail safe, which immediately makes me smile because we go straight to Dr. Strangelove. But let's stop. Let's halt. Let's just hold on, fail safe, with Henry Fonda and a cast of very serious and grave people making statements about the end of the world. Fail safe involved a theory that was practiced by the Strategic Air Command during the Cold War. You have three legs of the triad to launch a counter value or counter weapons.
Force. Yeah.
Force strike. Thank you, Germanicus. The three weapons are the submarine fleet with its ballistic missiles that can be launched anywhere from the ocean, the missile fleet launching from the silos across the western part of the United States, or the bomber fleet. The bomber fleet was significant because it was the only part of the triad that could be recalled in the event that there was a mistake. So it was always necessary to keep the bomber fleet active and put it up immediately when there was a threat. And the bomber fleet would go to its assigned positions and wait to see if there really was a war, whether it got the go code. The position they held somewhere over the Arctic, this is very romantic, somewhere over the Arctic, they would hold this position. It was called the fail-safe position. That would be the last moment that they would receive a turn back order. If they went past that moment, they were to listen to nothing. They were to hear nothing. And so much so that during the original movie of Fail Safe, we have the wife of one of the captains of the bomber that has damaged incoming radio communication and cannot get the return to base. There's been a false alarm. And she's screaming at him. But he's trained to ignore everything, that the Russians can manufacture any piece of news to turn us back. And he turns her off. It's very dramatic. Germanicus, I tell the fail-safe story quickly. How did you regard it when you first saw it? We were younger men.
The great truth that Dr. Strangelove elucidated was to lift the veil on the sanctimony of the liberal pieties and bromides of the early 60s. So here you have a Kennedy administration going full bore, producing 30, 40,000 nuclear weapons, totally overawing the Soviet Union, and yet producing movies like Failsafe, in which, the U.S. Liberal establishment was so anti-war and anti-nuclear, and it's a terrible thing, and it's an incredible hypocrisy. And so Strangelove is the movie to watch. Failsafe is the movie to analyze, because it shows how a false front can be put forward by the reigning establishment to burnish its image, to make itself look good, whereas in reality it is as aggressive as they would then accuse the so-called right-wing crazy presidential contender Barry Goldwater of being. And in fact, they were the ones who were, brandishing the nuclear stick most vigorously. And so you'd have guys like Dan O'Hurley and Henry Fonda, looking like, oh, why are we here? This shouldn't be happening. It's really a sociocultural vignette. That shows you how lucky we were to have escaped a direct confrontation with the Soviet Union, and it's a artful piece of propaganda, but the sanctimony is dripping from it, and it's a sanctimony that is not unlike, very similar to, the endless sanctimonious propaganda that the previous administration put out about the evil of Russia and the need to prosecute the war to save the poor ravished maiden Ukraine. And so, it's an abiding continuity in cultural terms.
I want to look at one detail at Failsafe. This movie was extremely controversial, extremely popular for the art crowd. Black and white, 1962, I believe. Let me see.
Yeah, it was.
64.
Well, the novel was 62, so the movie came out in 64. Yeah.
And Strangelove is a takeoff of Failsafe. So if you've seen Strangelove,
well, actually, they all come from a novel, Red Alert, and Red Alert had to sue Hollywood because they were stealing its plot and story. But that's another issue altogether.
The Walter Matthau character is our nuclear scientist guru, who is a
yes.
And seduces women at Washington parties, cocktail parties, where senators hang out and drink too much, and they stay up all night. But he gives a lecture in the beginning of his Failsafe.
Yeah.
Make a case for massive nuclear attack in the event of a mistake. Don't hold back. And the movie is about a mistake. The president, Henry Fonda, understood to be virtuous and tormented, and a very young
Adlai Stevenson type,
a very young Larry Hagman is the translator, and they Hagman, who was JR in the Dallas series many years, they put Hagman and Fonda in a room together without anything on the wall, no communication device, a completely make-up idea of the red phone to Moscow, and the president, through Hagman's translation, speaks directly to the Soviet premier.
Right, which wasn't possible at that time, by the way.
Been out in Omaha, where Strategic Air Command has that big map on the wall showing the bombers going closer and closer. There are many dramatic moments, such as when they send fighter jets trailing after the bomber that has not received the recall code, and they order them to catch up with their afterburners, knowing that they're not going to be able to reach it, and there's no reason to send rescue. So 4 planes splash in the Arctic waters. Our captain on board the B-52, when they avoid the Russian counterattack, he makes the case that we were bathed with so much radiation we don't have long to live. So let's go in at 0 feet above our detonation point. In other words, nothing but death throughout the movie. And the end of it, to give it away, because it is 50 years old, and they have used that term in the bomb, in the attack on Russian air bases, and I'm sure the Russians are not entertained by using that title. The payoff is Moscow is destroyed. They hear the whine of the telephone line from the ambassador melt, knowing that the bomber got through and destroyed Moscow with a 20 megaton thermonuclear weapon. The president then orders a B-58 over New York to drop a bomb. I
Well,
was. But my
yeah,
16. I was 16. You were a little younger. That
yes, a bit.
I recall that being a chilling moment. I didn't know what New York meant. I knew it was us. I didn't know what the pigeons flying off at the end. I, I had no
Well,
idea, but I knew it
I'll
was
ha-
a defeat. That's the sense I had at 16.
well, it was so liberal because my friends and I, we were younger, and the thing we liked about the movie, we didn't care about anything else at the time, was the fact that the B-58 was the coolest, hottest bomber we'd ever seen. And the truth is, it was a failure as a bomber, and the only kind of attack it could have been made by the B-58 Hustler, which was its nickname, was to bomb New York. And the idea of dropping 220 megaton bombs on New York, which is what the movie calls for, would have devastated the entirety of the Northeast. It was almost as bad as having a nuclear war. And it is just an amazingly dark movie that represents, I think, or rather sums up the kind of liberal Democrat consciousness of the time. And yet you have to remember, those are the same liberal Democrats who were like Walter Matthau. In fact, Walter Matthau in this movie is wholly reminiscent to me of Harold Brown, who is known as Bomber Brown during this very period, Secretary of the Air Force during the Vietnam era. And I actually co-taught a course with him at SAIS, Johns Hopkins, in the very early 80s. And he was exactly like Walter Matthau in terms of his demeanor. He was cold as ice and had that clear-eyed approach that in the early 60s was, yeah, we've got to do it. And it's just such a, looking back, it is so astonishing that we made it through that period. And what is equally astonishing right now is how you have people like the Walter Matthau character talking again about going to war with Russia, especially voices emanating from Britain, as though they have completely forgotten this era. And yet the Soviets have tremendous nuclear strike capabilities, far better than they had in 62. In 62, they did not have the capacity to even strike the United States. So effectively, Henry Fonda killed 30 million Americans for no reason.
And
But
it's possible, Germanicus, that
yeah,
thing fails safe and putting it on the video that Keith did, that it was done by men and women who are ignorant of what we're talking about. Is that possible?
you mean in terms of the strikes today, the very carefully calculated
No,
and
of what it meant at the time, how we received it, what the movie represents today, the themes in the movie, that they were using it just as a checkpoint. You know, we are going to hit you where it hurts, the way failsafe threatened the world. That they're just using this as an obvious ploy and have no understanding of the depth of that movie.
you
And
mean the people in Kiev today.
Kiev and whoever approved that.
Well, the shocking thing, and just remember, I should have been more clear. I mean, Failsafe came out in '64 during the campaigning season against Goldwater, and it was meant to show the Democrats in the best light so that LBJ would be reelected. But the fact is, today there is no understanding of the potential for chaos and mayhem and absolute calamity that could result from the kind of actions that you see Kiev pursuing in their effort to escalate this war. For them, everything is about staying in power another month, another year, and continue to get the hundreds of millions of dollars, which they can skim a few million off the top for themselves, every one of them. And it's a venal enterprise that has no awareness of what they could get
I want
the
to
rest of the world into.
push this a little dramatic. Is it
Mhm.
possible Secretary of State Rubio doesn't know? Is it possible that we're being led by younger men and women, mostly men, who pleased Mr. Trump. He has no memory of these matters. I doubt very much whether he ever saw the movie Failsafe. And he doesn't carry with him the burden of irony that we've been expressing in these few minutes. Is it possible that they're all ignorant, that they see this as a checklist for threatening nuclear weapons and not as a complete document that now, looking back upon it, shows the scale of failure of the moment, not success?
The current deep state, meaning the agencies and departments within the executive branch that have been wholly engaged in the Ukraine war to bring down Russia, are still desperate to continue the war. Their eyes are on the prize, and they'll never be off the prize. However, I think, sadly, or maybe it's one of the great ironies of our time, is that Russia, that knows the consequences of real escalation, and that wants nothing of that because of where it can take Russia, is showing enormous forbearance. And we rely unknowingly and consciously on their forbearance and their restraint.
You're talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis also here. You're saying that Russia, we're counting on the fact that Khrushchev and the Politburo backed down on purpose. They thought it was madness. They were the ones who backed off. Kennedy expected to be hit.
Well, Khrushchev was at Stalingrad and had to report to Stalin, and thought when he was taken, "Oh, Stalin will see you now. The man of steel will see you now." Khrushchev thought to himself, "This is the end."
But I'm talking about 62. It was 62 that Khrushchev knew he
Yeah, I know. But Khrushchev came out of the Great Patriotic War, and that war killed 1 out of every 6 Russians. And so they had the restraint kind of baked into them, I would argue.
They've been much more responsible in reflection than the United States national security apparatus. And whoever approved, there's no reason to put failsafe there unless you're sending some kind of drumbeat to the Russians. And if they'd put Strangelove there, I would have loved them. That's what belongs there.
Well, let's talk about failsafe from a different standpoint than what you described. In the early 1960s, the U.S. had something like 2,000 intercontinental strategic bombers in bases surrounding the Soviet Union, from Morocco to Alaska. And the fail-safe means that at any moment we can unleash hell on the Soviet Union. And it wouldn't be until the later 60s that the Soviets had the actual usable capacity, reliable capacity to strike back. So if you want to talk about being aggressive, we were maximally aggressive at that time, and we have been equally aggressive in a different way, but equally fervent in our desire to bring down Russia in the last 10 years vis-a-vis Ukraine.
Let's turn to Yugoslavia. You know what I mean. Germanic is Michael Vlahos. I am Gaius, John Batchelor. We're in Londinium. We got a little exercise because, Hollywood, okay? We were young. So we'll turn to something much more immediate at hand, which is the breakup of a make-believe country. It happened once upon a time at the end of the 20th century when Yugoslavia broke up into pieces that are still at odds with each other, sometimes at mortal odds. And are we witnessing that in Ukraine is the question I'm going to ask Germanicus. The Thames is turbulent, as it should be in springtime. We've had lots of rain. And in America, they also have had lots of rain. It's a spring night. The birds are happy. It's a little chillier in parts, but that is the North Temperate Zone. In the South Temperate Zone, Australia, for example, which I routinely speak to, they're entering winter. And did all of you know that the birds in Australia do not migrate for winter? Did you know that? Birds that are very similar to ours. They have magpies, we have magpies, but they don't have anywhere to go.
They're
Antarctica,
patriotic.
yes, Antarctica is blowing in those cold winds, so they stay exactly where they live year round. When we come back, Yugoslavia. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm John Batchelor. Is the Friends of History Debating Society in Londinium. It is 91 AD, springtime, and Germanicus is here, and the centurions are still with us because their light stays with us longer. They send their families on home. The centurions are the backbone of the empire. The empire is very strong in the 1st century AD, as it will be in the 2nd century AD. We have historians, we have scholars, we have philosophers, we have an emperor. The emperor is unpopular. Every emperor is unpopular after Augustus eventually, or sometimes right away. We are observing, however, the 21st century. And while we've been exercised about a Hollywood movie, we don't get exercised about this topic. It's just a puzzle. It's a thought experiment. Germanicus, Yugoslavia, a country in the Balkans from 1918 to 1992. It's important to mention that 1918 again. That is a product of the Versailles Treaty, which is probably the trigger for most of the tragedy of the 20th century after 1918. Yugoslavia was make-believe, putting together Slovenes, Croats, Serbs, Serbians, Bosnians, kingdoms, dukedoms, pieces of this empire and that empire, including what is now understood to be the Western Balkans, impenetrable feuds ongoing. Right now, Vučić, the president of Serbia, is at odds with his own people over inviting the Chinese to build a bad railroad terminal that collapsed on people, and he was indifferent to it, and the corruption was the product. Right now. So what we're looking at is the remains of Yugoslavia are still at odds with each other. So the question I asked Germanicus is Ukraine another Yugoslavia? Are we watching the breakup of an artificial state, and that we've entered into this as if we're defending the beaches of the White Cliffs of Dover? Germanicus, is it make-believe? Are we fighting a futile war?
Well, the Treaty of Trianon establishing Yugoslavia quite explicitly threw all these different nationalities together, and they were split between the nationalities that had been part of Austria-Hungary, those that had been part of the Ottoman Empire, and it never cohered. And in that sense, the same can be said of Ukraine, in that Ukraine was pulled together in the venality of Stalin's vision of a greater Soviet empire, socialism in one country, as it was put in a 1923 speech. And as such, his acquisitive spirit ended up gobbling up much of what had been part of Austria-Hungary, namely Galicia, which included Hungarians, Ruthenians, the Bukovina, which was Romanian, Moldavia, and it was all pulled into a Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic that was completely made up. There had been no such thing under the Russian Empire. There had been hetmanships in the steppe lands of Cossacks who had joined Russia and pledged their fealty to Catherine the Great. And this goes back to the later 17th century, including the Zaporizhian Cossacks, which I guess are the beginning of a Ukrainian identity, but it's not really Ukrainian at that point. It's Cossack. And the southern parts had been part of the Tatarstan of the Khanate of Crimea, which was a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire until the late 18th century. And there is no basis for a coherent Ukrainian state, but it must be said that there are nationalist visions that emerged out of that welter of the post World War I and Stalinist periods that attempted to create a Ukrainian nationality, and it never had a kind of real authenticity, in large part because there is no real way, at least from what I've seen, to reconcile the Ukrainian speaking Western lands that had been part of Austria Hungary, and before that, Poland, and then after Austria Hungary, again Poland, and then under Stalin, with the eastern parts of what we call Ukraine, which were explicitly populated through forced migration by Russians at the order of Stalin in the 1930s. And it created essentially not simply a bifurcated country, but as you said, a place that was administratively well defined and recognized after 1945 as being an independent nation by the United Nations, which was what Stalin demanded. And it was a huge error, as we can now see. I mean, the Soviet Union wanted to have more than one vote in the General Assembly. So Stalin insisted that Belarus and Ukraine, as well as the Russian Federation, have votes in the UN as though they were independent, but they were not. Everything was a house of cards. And, to make things even worse, in 1956, Khrushchev, who was himself Ukrainian, decided to gift, as they say today, the Crimea to this artificial place called Ukraine. So the whole place is a confabulation. And it could be compared to Yugoslavia, but my point is that Yugoslavia had explicit nationalities that never went away. They were coherent. For example, Croatia had been part of Venice for centuries, as was Slovenia. And the Bosnia and the places like the Sanjak of Novi Pazar had been part of the Ottoman Empire for centuries, and et cetera, et cetera. And so there is no such lineality or tradition in Ukraine. Everything is cobbled together and has taken root and form to the extent it has only in the last century. So it's all very amorphous and does not have any real cultural and political standing.
And the American response to Yugoslavia's breakup was to bomb Belgrade. Was that it? That it, Germanicus? That was Bill Clinton's bright idea.
Well, the U.S. Over the course of the Cold War had built up an ideological animus against Russia, and that included friendly Slavic polities like Yugoslavia, which after the breakup left Serbia as a totally Slavic state, and we would support the nice Catholic Croatians and Slovenians and the nice Muslim Bosnians, but or even the Albanian Muslim Kosovars, but we didn't like the Serbians. And so it's all based on a kind of unexamined and unself-conscious prejudice about the Slavs. And if you stand back and look at it, the prejudice against Russia and Slavic peoples is very reminiscent of that of the Third Reich. And that is kind of another irony that you can add to the mix.
Then again, we have to entertain the possibility that our leadership, both the previous administration
Mm-hmm.
That is increasingly a question as to who is leading. But I'll just leave it. The administration was uninformed of these ironies, and the present administration is uninformed of these ironies, and they really
Yeah.
do treat it like the White Cliffs of Dover, that we've got to stop them on the beaches.
Well, there's certainly, as I said, an institutional um, shoulder to shoulder commitment to create a free Ukraine and to bring down Russia, and that's a big problem. I'm not so sure that prejudice is embedded in the president and those around him, but it's very hard to turn around a ship of state that has gone so far in this direction. And to Mr. Trump's credit, he has tried, but I'm not sure he has um, the capacity in terms of allies within the government and within the executive branch that can make his desires come true, and that's a big issue. I mean, we're at a point now, an inflection point, where if we can move ahead on negotiations with Russia, there's a chance that we can move toward a settlement in Ukraine, and that speaks to the desperation of Kiev and the regime to try and find a desperate last minute escalation by provoking Russia into some sort of newsworthy barbarity that will force the administration to return to a war against Russia. But if that can be avoided, then there's still some hope here. But it's a problem with many layers, and it is hard to see how it will be resolved.
I like how upbeat you are about this, because I was gloomier when we started this conversation. It is true, though, towards the end of these negotiated settlements, there's
Yeah,
always an outbreak somewhere that's out of
right.
control. Terribly. I was watching a World War II movie last night. It doesn't matter which one. I watch them all again every time. I get the same lessons every time. And I don't know, it's like drawing from a well of remembrance. And I was reminded again and again how the German army, not a bad army when it started out, fought beyond reason in the last 3 months till surrender, beyond reason, suicidally beyond reason. And our casualty rate climbed each week because of the resistance that made no sense. They were surrounded, they were cut off, they were surrendering in the tens of thousands every day. And still the ones who had weapons fought on and persecuted their own people if they didn't participate in the fighting, and put 11-year-olds in uniforms out there with weapons to die. And that reminded me that towards the end of these negotiations, there's always that flashpoint. I
Yeah,
don't think we've hit
yeah.
it yet with Ukraine. I don't think so. Do you see Ukraine ending quietly, or do you see Ukraine with a provocation that's a bridge too far?
I don't know that they can pull that off. The one they pulled off in the last 24 hours was pretty unusual. I mean, they were launching drones from within Russia, and
But it was clearly a propaganda move. It wasn't a desperation move.
well, I mean, it depends on what they have. If they put together something really,
I mean, assassination.
yeah, a dirty bomb or something, yeah,
Uh,
you could potentially do that, but it really looks like they've shot their bolt at this point. And I'm not sure that something that was really excessive would find any support, certainly on the part of Mr. Trump. So I think certainly the Russian response and its restraint shows that Russia feels that above all they need to shrug these things off, no matter how painful and difficult it is.
Boy, we're depending on them a lot. Wow. That's what you're saying. We're depending on them being the grown-up in the room.
Yeah. Well, they want the war to end, and they don't want it to start up again 5 years down the road. So I can understand where they're coming from.
Germanicus and Gaius talking about, well, we're always getting back to Ukraine because it reminds us so much of the lessons of the last 50 years in the Cold War. Well, we're going to turn to philosophy when we come back. Gaius has been doing a very dangerous thing. He's been reading the seventh letter of Plato, and Germanicus has reviewed his seventh letter of Plato as well. So, fair warning to the audience, this is live. We're not quite sure where we're going, but I mentioned that Plato, towards the end of the Republic, turned really mystical, as if he had access to magic mushrooms. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm John Batchelor. I am Gaius. Germanicus is here. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. We're in Londinium, and we're about to talk Plato. So if you're fair warned, you could leave. It's a live talk in the 21st century. There are not many of us who want to contest Plato and what he meant in the Republic, but it comes back to classicists, and every once in a while they want us to read their books, and we do. I recommend a new book, James Fromm, professor at Bard College. It's called Plato and the Tyrant. It's actually based on activity of Plato. 3 times he visited a city-state, Syracuse, on Sicily, a very powerful Syracuse at the time. This is 4th century BCE, after Sparta defeated Athens and before Alexander marched. And there's a connection to Alexander here. Plato founded the Academy. Aristotle studied at the Academy, and Aristotle was tutor to Alexander and his older good friend Ptolemy. So there's a connection. However, we're going to concentrate on Plato at the end of the Republic. Now, Plato's idea was here to give advice to government, what government is best and how. He'd come up against the 30 tyrants in Athens that had led them in despair because they wanted democracy. But the 30 tyrants included one cousin of Plato, so he felt it personally. And he wanted to make recommendations about what is a good government. And he had this idea. He didn't invent this term. That was 18th century philosopher king. He was talking about when is a man not a tyrant? When is he a good leader? They had the word king, but they didn't use it routinely. And he came to the conclusion that a good king has philosophy and understands the nature of government and has authority because he understands the nature of government. Practically speaking, however, it came down to tyrant after tyrant after tyrant, and that's the lessons of Syracuse. I welcome Germanicus's thoughts here. What I mention, because it's often left out of the discussion of the Republic, and you college students have had to read it. We did too when we were in college, and I haven't thought about it that much for 50 years, but here it is. At the end of the Republic, Plato tells the story of the myth of Ur. Ur was a man's name, and there was a battle somewhere, and everybody died, and the corpses were left on the field. When the families did come to collect the corpses, they collected Ur, but he set up. He wasn't dead. And they go, what is this? Everybody's decomposing. You're alive. How did this happen? And he told this story, that he'd traveled to a place that was astral-like, stars all around, no particular land. He was moving across it. And he kept, on this journey, he got very thirsty, dry land around him. And they came to a river, and the river named the River of Forgetfulness. Those who drank deeply of it forgot everything about this transition from death to life to life. But if you drink just modestly, you can remember. And therefore, what you're remembering is about the higher life, beauty, justice, the forms. You're also remembering that reincarnation is all. And then you pass the river and you get to a decision point, not unlike in Harry Potter, where you get to choose what college you belong in. The hat tells you. All right, you get to say what you want to be in the next life. I tried to answer them. I wanted to be a Springer Spaniel, but professor said, no, it has to be human. The irony here is Odysseus would choose to be a common man, an ordinary man, not a hero. And chose to be himself and return to his family, and he did. And that was the end of the story. Plato told that story in all gravity at the end of the Republic. And I don't have a payoff here so much, Germanicus, as to say that story makes me doubt Plato is more than a very, very, very successful and like the Mark Twain of the 4th century, spellbinding, a good storyteller, but not somebody to trust for government. Because in my reading of the 7th letter, and there were 13 letters, some of them are not real, some of them are, and most of them are real. According to a debate that's been going on for 2,500 years, for heaven's sakes, every generation condemns or approves of the Republic. My observation is that we in the United States, despite our vanity of having a republic, representative speakers going to Washington and hashing out government for all of us with checks and balances, despite our vanity, we have a tyranny, alternate tyranny, and it's balanced. It goes this way, it goes that way, it goes back and forth. Certainly, you could say, in a rough way, the Biden administration went to the left with dictation. Now the Trump Republican administration going to the right with dictation. The diktat. It's not checks and balances. It's not 3 articles of the Constitution and the different branches treating each other with respect. It's I want this to happen, and then after the next election, I want that to happen. And that makes me disappointed if we think we're following your measure.
It seems, to me at least, that Plato is a kind of Elmer Gantry of his day without the fire and brimstone. And I would never have thought that at all without the opportunity to see his epistles, especially this 7th letter, and realize that he's not only just a guy trying to get by, but also a guy who has to defend his reputation and who has obligations to continue to show his relevance and his claim to be, if not oracular, because he never claims that, then to have, like a seer, this intense insight. And so what's interesting about this letter is that he is, first of all, of necessity, trying to defend his position and to explain all the things he did in Syracuse, like trying to teach Dionysius, and then supporting the new tyrant who overthrew him. And it shows a guy who is just a guy. And that is cool, because Plato is so strangely elevated in our discourse. But the third thing, though, is I never realized how mystical Plato could be in his thought, and this gets back to the Elmer Gantry analogy, in the sense that he was kind of a preacher, and he wasn't going to let his new student, Dionysius, teach him anything. And he wasn't going to accept the fact that this kid would be uppity. And so it reveals a very human Plato, and it also shows in its own way, the need for Greek Hellenistic civilization at that time to provide this larger sense of meaning and to explain the cosmos, and so it's rather interesting that way. And finally, you see Plato navigating the shoals and eddies and currents of contemporary politics and trying to make sense of them, in contrast to his kind of framing of a more perfect representation, which of course he presents in the Republic. And so he's trying to uh, bring some sense to politics and make it a little bit better than what it actually is. And it's actually not very nice. And this gets to your point about dictatorship, is that within politics as we know it today, and probably always, this has always been so, is that politics is about power, and power is fleeting, if not evanescent. And so it is open to abuse, and typically there is no balanced situation as the founders, the American founders, would have hoped, in which no individual could gain a position of lasting power over others. And of course, that is true in America even now. There is no lasting tyranny. No tyrant is able to hold sway for more than a few years. And so, in that sense, the system works. But it does seem as though this truth is inescapable, even, for example, in the Roman Republic, which, well, we can only guess at what Plato might have thought of the Roman Republic at its height. But even there, you had a tendency toward an unraveling of comedy and of a sense of collegiality between senators, and a movement eventually toward a more oligarchic system, and then ultimately toward a dictatorship. And it gives one pause.
I'm remembering that the Romans were aware, certainly they were aware of Plato, but I don't believe they made a cult of Plato. That came during the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
Right. So our tradition of Plato is much more involved and sober than the Roman position, is my memory, but I haven't read about Rome reflecting on Plato. Now, there is Plutarch to mention, first century, contemporary of ours, born under Claudius or Nero, one or the other, and living until Hadrian's time. And Plutarch's lives defend Dion, the brother-in-law who eventually becomes the hero to Plato,
right,
and then disappoints everybody by being a usual
another tyrant. Yeah, right.
Plutarch defended Dion, and you sort of eliminated certain points where he used political assassination to retain power. So I'm going to guess that Plutarch was influential, is going to be influential to the Roman world. And really, the idea of defending a despot doesn't come naturally to Greeks. It does to us Romans. When we get an emperor we like, we don't care what he's up to.
Well, one of the you're citing Plutarch, I think, is really essential here, because it brings to the fore the salient countervailing element in Greco-Roman polity, and that is the dominance of an idealized model person.
Right.
And the fact that that model person is the thing to which you, the ambitious young man who is quite willing to become a tyrant if possible, should aspire to. And therefore, that model as an ideal becomes in its own literary and rhetorical fashion, the primary element of restraint, and it actually operates as such. And this brings to mind the fact that the Roman Republic, at its most successful, also its earlier days before it became too big and too rich, had that ethos, a great Greek word, as its lodestar, and it actually worked. So the image of Cincinnatus, Horatius at the bridge, and other model men actually did serve as a break on excessive behavior. But it's interesting that in the Roman world that actually worked, even when there weren't as many actual political breaks and counterbalances. And what is sad and revealing about our time is that we do not have a model that we collectively applaud and long to follow. And what worries me most about our society right now is not so much the form of tyranny, but rather the spirit of tyranny, and the fact that a society that has no model of ideal behavior and restraint and humanity, which of course the Greco-Roman world enshrined, ours is a society in which major excess is always right around the corner. And we know this from looking at the world of Europe in the 20th century and Hitler and Stalin. And then, of course, Mao, et cetera, et cetera. So there is some great quality to Greco-Roman civilization, and I think you just identified it through Plutarch.
Recommending to the audience, fail-safe. Watch Fail-Safe, then watch Strangelove and laugh. Just laugh. It didn't happen then. Germanicus is Michael Vlahos. This is live. I am John Batchelor, Gaius. We're going on to the sacrifice to the god Augustus, who's our perfect emperor. Yeah, he was a dictator, but he was smart too. He had trouble with his daughter. Everybody can sympathize with him in retrospect. And then we're going on to the theater, and I have reason to believe we're going to see scenes from the clouds. That's Aristophanes' idea of a comedy. The part that is funny is the thinkery, the thinkery supervised by Socrates, where all the bums and wastrels of society gather, the thinkery, capital T. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm John Batchelor.